Arthur Norman Prior was undoubtedly one of the great logicians of our century, from 1914 to 1969 when he died. We have been granted an interview with his widow, Dr. Mary Prior. This is the morning of 5th October 1997. The interview is performed by Per Hasle, that is myself, and Peter Østrøm. So, Mrs. Prior, you first met your husband, your future husband, Arthur Prior, in 1943. Can you tell us about that meeting, your first meeting and your first impressions of Arthur?
Well, it's a very long time ago. It's now about 28 years since Arthur died, and my memory tends to be very streaky, but it's the earliest part which I remember most clearly, partly because of changing circumstances, and partly, well, when I say changing circumstances, I mean the different universities we were at changed the whole sort of structure of life, and also because I tended to move from philosophy, in which I had an original training, into history. And so in the later part of the time I was beginning to work in history, and although I read Arthur's papers, he had to explain them, and they were getting more and more technical, and I didn't realise until after he died how much I was really not standing on my own feet, but simply leaning on him. We met on the last night of a conference in January 1943, and at the time it was a terrific meeting. We talked for about 5 hours, almost non-stop, and I think we felt we came, in a way, though from very different worlds. I had just been a student and was going back to do some postgraduate work, and Arthur had graduated some years earlier. He had been expected to do extremely well, but in fact had not done so very well, and failed to gain the scholarship which would have taken him overseas. He belonged to an extremely brilliant and rather bolshy generation, which was quite a legend at the time I went to university. So I was very interested in meeting him. And though I suppose we both thought of ourselves as very different people, sorts of people, in fact, when I look back now, I see that we had a great many similarities in our backgrounds. We both came from families which had nonconformist ministers in them. Both had doctors, both had missionaries, and so that in a way there was a lot we could take for granted in talking to each other, which we didn't realise at the time.
Thank you. Please tell us about your first years together, I mean up till 1949.
Well, after we had married late in 1943, Arthur, who was in the Air Force, was sent overseas soon after the birth of our child, a year later, and so he was away a long time then, and we corresponded daily at that time. when he came back and was demobbed, he managed to get a job at the at Canterbury University College, as the University of Canterbury then was, as a temporary replacement for Popper, who just left to go overseas, and we at that time, just before we moved to Christchurch, our house was burnt down, and with it a lot of Arthur's papers, which were fairly largely concerned with Scottish theology in the 17th century. And we replaced what we could and moved up to Christchurch. And the university at that time was a most exciting place to be. It was full of a mixture of men returning from overseas and the Air Force, conscientious objectors, and just the ordinary students you would expect straight from school. And everyone seemed to be catching up on lost time. And of course, people like Arthur were catching up on the subjects they were having to teach as well. And there was very little difference in a way between staff and students, because so many of them were the same age. And so often students were older than staff, and you got extraordinary reversals, like conscientious objectors on the staff teaching colonels as students and so on. So it was an amazing time, and I'm sure it had a great effect on Arthur as a teacher generally, because his students were very important people to him, and it was a very sort of democratic place, marvellous place at that time. Now, as he taught, of course, the Scottish theology had to take somewhat of a back place, because he had to teach a syllabus in which he taught all the philosophy. It was a joint philosophy and psychology department. So he taught logic and ethics as a basic course, and then he taught logic to any takers. It was an option, and general philosophy, and then there was an option of it was a choice that people could do of one of 4 papers, one on the ancients, one on Locke, Berkeley and Hume, one on Kant and Hegel, and then I think there was a modern paper which was largely people like John Stuart Mill up to about early Russell, but I can't quite remember what that one was. So, and it was in this, out of this context, that Logic and the Basis of Ethics was written. It was rather nice, because the day that our daughter Anne was born was the day on which the first advanced copy of Logic and the Basis of Ethics appeared. So I presented him with a baby, and he presented me with his book.
It's very interesting to learn how some of the interests that Arthur was to pursue later on also were induced by the curriculum which he had to teach. But of course he did, as a young man, write a number of papers in with theological, historical themes. And this project, History of Scottish Theology, was also in the same vein. But that project was given up then after your house burned down in 49. You know, there's still this manuscript in the Bodleian library where you can see signs of burns.
Yes, that was our second fire.
That was your second fire, yes, you were rather unfortunate. But at least from a superficial point of view. But it was sort of a turning point, you have once said.
Yes, it was.
So Arthur gave up the project after that, and his interest seems to have veered more definitively towards logic from that time on.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
Can you say a little bit about this change in interest and
yes,
the importance of that project?
Well, he started working on logic really also as an extension of what he was teaching, and he started working on a book called The Craft of Formal Logic, and this was all very traditional stuff, mainly it was Aristotelian and medieval. No. Yes. There was some medieval stuff went into it too. But it was it didn't show a great deal of knowledge of the field of medieval logic compared with what he knew later. It was quite limited in that respect. But he sent that overseas, and it was suggested that he should put some more modern logic into this, and revise it. And in fact, he rewrote it completely. It emerged an entirely different work at the end, not as The Craft of Formal Logic, which I think they thought was a bit sort of homespun, but as Formal Logic.
Yes, the 1955
That was
book.
1955, yes. So we're going rather far ahead there. But in 1951, we went to a conference in Australia. In those days, nobody paid you for going to conferences or paid your fares or anything like that, so you had to scrape very hard to go. And it was tremendously worthwhile because it put Arthur in touch with the wider world. And he met the Wittgensteinians in Melbourne, as well as the Andersonians in Sydney, and he found, I think he was amazed to get any feedback on logic and the basis of ethics. But Jack Smart, who was at that conference, simply walked straight across the room with his hand outstretched to shake him by the hand and say, in a very loud voice, that he had read Logic and the Basis of Ethics, and people in Oxford were talking about it. He was just fresh out from Oxford. He had just come to Adelaide. And this was his friendship with Jack developed from then on, and also with John Mackey. These were both people who were to play an important part in his life, and with whom he corresponded a great deal all his life. From then on, he began to develop a wide correspondence, first with Australians and then a wider world. These letters were extremely important to him because they were his only way of communicating with the outer world at that time. Is it?
Is the sound all right still, Peter?
Yeah.
Okay. It's just because your mic has turned a little bit. That's why I asked.
Perhaps even a bit better.
Oh, good.
Okay. Okay. We'll continue. Now that conference was in 1951, as you
Yes.
said. Of course, the invention of tense logic is what Arthur is by far most remembered for, and he developed that in the course of the 50s and the 60s. But you know, there were the first suggestions in his writings at all that there could be a logic of time distinctions are found in the manuscript for The Craft of Formal Logic, which you mentioned.
Yes.
But did
I'd forgotten that.
you had well, but was that the first time that Arthur started taking an interest in the concept of time as such, or did he think about time and temporality earlier than that?
I don't remember him doing so, but of course one never knows what's going on and what's crossing a person's mind without it coming out. I mean, I don't know all Arthur's thoughts. But I remember very dramatically, it was, I think, in 1954. Yes, it must have been late 1954, even possibly early 1955, when it was after I had been ill, and he came and he sat on my bed, and he said to me, "I think I can see how tenses can be formalized." And he said it's based on a footnote in John Findlay, who had been his teacher in New Zealand. When you look at it, it is a remarkably interesting footnote.
Yes, we have it here. So perhaps you would care to
Shall I
read
read
it?
Yes, well, this is what Arthur
To
read to
repeat
me.
history.
X present equals bracket X present, close bracket, present. X future equals bracket X future, close bracket, present, equals bracket X present, bracket, future. All such comparatively recondite propositions as that bracket X, bracket, full stop, bracket X past, bracket future. Is it colon or semicolon? Semicolon. That is, all events past and future will be past.
Yes, thank you. The very idea of relating logic to time was really a novelty at that time. In many ways it was unorthodox, and later on modal logic, for instance, was attacked by people like notably Quine. Could you characterize Arthur's position towards mainstream logic and philosophy in general? Although I know that's difficult, but
Well, all this is
just in a broad sweep.
all this is a very long time ago. I think Arthur started from, well, really a Russellian position. He, as he read medieval writers, particularly, I think he began to see that there were other things which could be formalized, which you couldn't formalize at all in Russell, and yet which, as he began to recognise, did have a structure which could be formalised as tense logic and modal logic were, and that this way of formalising things to do with the contingent world were very worth doing. Now, what was your next bit of your question?
Well, that was how that influenced his position towards logic in general and analytical philosophy.
Oh, analytical philosophy.
Yes, because although, I mean, he was in a sense, it seems to me, he was close to analytical philosophy, using linguistic examples, using formalization as a method and a goal in itself. But nevertheless, he was also different from the analytical mainstream.
Yes.
And I know he had heated discussions sometimes with analytical philosophers.
Yes, he used to come in. He'd come in after dining in college when he was in England, often quite flushed with excitement, crossing swords with them. I think the paper of his, which I think I most enjoy when he attacks some of their arguments, was the runabout inference ticket. And I think I like that particularly because for once he'd accepted a suggestion of mine for a title.
Yes.
Go ahead.
One could perhaps follow up on that question by saying that although Arthur was not in the continental tradition, there was some similarity in the sense that he had this historical awareness. He had read the same bits and pieces of, and more than that, of history of philosophy. Did he express misgivings about the lack of historical awareness among analytical philosophers?
Don't remember him expressing
No.
it, but I think it was. I think it was implicit in a lot of his work, and perhaps even stated. But I can't think of examples of it. No.
No. I think one of the sources from whom he got inspiration for historical work was Peter Geach.
Yes.
Geach sent him various material at various times,
Yes.
which were, among other things, on Buridan's Sophismata. Could you
Yes.
tell us about that?
Well, I can't. I remember Geach sent it to Arthur. I think it was before we. I think it was just before we set out to come to England to live, and because we had got to know Geach well before then, and he sent out a complete manuscript of Buridan, which Arthur worked on the boat coming over. The boat took a month, so he had lots of time. It was his constant companion. I think he copied out the whole of the manuscript himself and thought about it a great deal. He may have written an article at the time on the boat. I don't remember him doing so, though.
I was just wondering. This is off record, but I think he did publish. I think he used this material before 58.
He may have.
So could it not have been in 55?
Possibly he had it on the boat going back, but I always thought of it on the other way. But that my memory could easily be mistaken, very easily mistaken.
It's a detail, you know, but it was just it just struck me.
Yeah. No, I can't remember that, but certainly he had this manuscript on shipboard, and I don't know if Peter kept a copy himself. It was in the days before Xeroxing, Yeah.
Yes. Do you remember whether Peter Geach sent him anything earlier? Because I think Jack Copeland writes in one place that he early in the 50s received some material, probably from Peter Geach, which sent him to the sources, where he took up this idea that a proposition could alter its truth value with time.
I don't remember anything
no,
about that.
no,
I'm sorry.
No.
No.
No. Go on. 1954 was a difficult year for yourself. You were going into hospital with TB and for your family. Could you tell us about that year?
Yes, that was a really bad year. I actually landed in hospital at the end of '53. I spent Christmas Eve in a geriatric ward as being the only one open, and then I finally they discovered I had TB and sent me to a sanitarium. The children both had TB. They had caught it from me, and they were nursed at home because we knew hospitals had a very detrimental effect on children. And Arthur managed to get a trained nurse to look after the children, but of course he had to fill in between. And as I was in the sanatorium quite close by, he used to visit me every visiting day, and somehow he managed to work as well. I just don't know how he managed to do all he did in that year. He was quite extraordinary. Anyway, after 9 months, I came out, and it was at the end of that year that Gilbert Ryle visited. That was '54.
Yes.
And he brought an invitation with him for Arthur to give the John Locke lectures in Oxford. And of course that was to open many doors and put Arthur in touch with a tremendous number of people.
Yes. Yes, and 1956, which was the year that you spent in Oxford
Yes.
then, was a very exciting year by all sources.
Yes.
You made a lot of contacts, and Arthur also arranged the Oxford Logic Colloquium.
Yes.
Could you tell us about some of the persons you met at that time, and also about the colloquium and its importance?
Right. Well, after each John Locke lecture, which is a very formal occasion, Arthur organised a few days later an informal discussion of the paper, and this was held at our flat in it was 8 Park Town, and we had John Lemon used to come, and Ivo Thomas, and Peter Geach when he was about, because he was teaching in Birmingham at the time, so he was commuting because his wife Elizabeth Anscombe was teaching at Somerville, and they lived in Oxford. So those were very exciting occasions. Then, of course, Arthur met a lot of the sort of establishment philosophers, people like Gilbert Ryle, John Austin, and so on, who all came to the lectures but never to the discussions. It was their duty to attend the lectures. Then we sometimes students came to these as well, and other people dropped in, but John, Ivo and Peter were the nucleus of the group. We also met a lot of people from outside Oxford, often at conferences, and we got to know who in Oxford had an interest in philosophy, in logic, even if they didn't teach it. We found ultimately there was a nucleus of people with an interest in logic, which wasn't very common in Oxford. And this included, of course, people like well, it's not fair to say they had only an interest in logic, like Martha and Bill Neal, who were writing a history of logic at the time. And then people like Marcus Dick at Balliol. Dummett, of course, was writing on logic, but unfortunately he was away from Oxford until very late in the year, and we hardly saw anything of him as a result. But anyway, there were enough people interested for us to decide that there ought to be a colloquium on logic with people from inside and outside Oxford. And so we simply wrote to the people and we said, we're going to have a colloquium in Oxford, such and such dates, would you like to come? And there were a lot of people came. It's hard to tell now. It was somewhere between 20 and 40 people. It lasted over 2 days. On the last afternoon, after it was really sort of over, some of them went off punting together, and this resulted in an agreement to write a paper which was known as LMMPT after the writers of it, Lemon, Meredith. These were from Dublin, Pryor and Thomas, and that never came out until very much later, though it circulated in manuscript. And then that night we had a party in our flat. I've never known so much noise. Everyone was talking logic, you know, at parties after conferences. The discussion goes on, but rather more muted. Partly it was that we had a flat with a low ceiling and a sloping ceiling, and the noise bounced off it. But it was simply, I think, the excitement of people meeting each other for the first time and finding they had so much in common. It was a marvellous occasion.
Yes, I think this Oxford colloquium, logic colloquium, was a rather great event, and
it was the first.
Some authors say that it also actually helped stimulate the development of logic in England quite a lot.
I'm glad to hear it. Right.
So, in telling about the Oxford Logic Colloquium, you have already given some hints as to the atmosphere in your home life. A lot of people coming and going, and I think it was like that in New Zealand too. Authors, philosophers, students, established professors, and a lot of discussion going on.
Yes.
I think that might lead on to a question as to Arthur's way of working, his way with students, and perhaps how you would characterize him as a person.
Yes. Well, he worked when he felt like it, which was pretty well much most of the time. And when he wasn't working, he did not want to play games which involved the brain. He wanted to rest it. He didn't want to play bridge, for instance, or chess, or anything like that. He wanted to do things like playing with the children, walking, quite frivolous things. But he didn't enjoy working to a timetable very much. I mean, obviously he had to in some ways, but he wasn't a person who sat down at 9 in the morning and worked till 5 and then took a break and worked in the evening. He might work all night through. I remember quite often in the house we had in our last years in New Zealand, which was near the bush, I would go into his study in the morning, and I would find that there was a heap of moths which had flown in and which had been just below the light, where they had flown up to it and been singed, and they had died, and he had been working all night long, and this he was liable to do from time to time. Then he treated his students more or less as, well, he made very little difference between students which were able to engage in discussion from staff. I mean, they just were all talking the same language. And of course he didn't have very many staff who could talk that language in New Zealand. So his students were very important. Correspondents abroad and students were the sort of lifeline for him. That was really what life was like. And of course the university was rather 9 to 9, well, not 9 to 7, it tended to end up in the early evening. But there was nowhere very much where one could get together and talk. There was a staff common room and there was a student union, but there was no mixture between. So students used to often come to the house, either for seminars, or, well, they sometimes just came up to see us and talk.
Yes. But Arthur also had a bit of temper, didn't he?
Oh, yes.
He could get impatient.
Yes, he could get impatient. He could get, yes. I mean, logical perversity would make, or what he regarded as that, would make him impatient or even cross. And he did dislike pompous people, and people he thought were manipulative, or what he used to call scheming. The word manipulative wasn't in use really in those days, and he would call the one sort bullshit artists, and the other sort dicky lickers, and I had him once losing his temper entirely with a totally unreasonable landlady and telling her to crawl back into her cheese. We left the next day. This was when we were first married.